Okay, so kind of pick up where we left off, but a couple things to mention. I'll kind of go through them quickly. Want to make sure we have some time in class for a couple things. So I updated Canvas this morning, looking at those extra credit submissions. I then kind of took the original score, um, turned it into kind of worth out of 100 points, or took the percentage, added those 4 points in. So that midterm exam number two with the extra credit should be kind of what your grade is in terms of percent, adding in that 4% extra credit if you did that survey. Okay. Um, I also just did some things. I updated exam one just so it's displayed to you out of 100 points or kind of as a percentage. And then we'll have a new daily quiz today. At the end of class, I'll discuss the next Canvas discussion, number four. And then we have those module 10 materials. Those are all due before we start class tomorrow. So the module reading for 10, a daily quiz that was associated with that extra video that I posted up on YouTube along with yesterday's class. And that really should kind of cover it in terms of, oh, I also, if you did that module reading, because I extended a day, I kind of had to create that new assignment. I merged those scores, so those should be updated on Canvas in the gradebook as well. Other than that, unless there's any questions for me, we can jump into material here. Oh, any questions before you get going? Okay, so we left off kind of thinking about how does the government close deflationary gaps with spending or tax changes. We then talked about kind of that relationship to balanced budgets. Um, so one thing that I think we'll kind of talk about here today is what if I had a balanced budget? What combination of government spending and taxes would I need in order to keep that budget balanced, right? So we kind of covered this a little bit last class, but I just wanted to kind of do some review and reiterate this point. So let's say we wanted a balanced budget, right? What amounts of government spending and taxes would offset each other? Well, last class we kind of said that change in real GDP from taxes and government spending, if we want them to be equal, right, offset each other, then we had the change in government spending times that multiplier effect would have to be the same as the change in taxes times its multiplier effect. Now we had to remember there's kind of a negative sign here that these things work in opposite directions. If I increase government spending, right, the same change that would cause the increase in real GDP would have to be a decrease in taxes, putting more money out there, giving more consumers more money, or kind of putting more money out there in terms of government spending. So when we rearrange this equation, we said that change in government spending would have to be the change in taxes times that marginal propensity to consume. Now, this is if we wanted these two changes to be equal. We wanted them both to increase aggregate demand. If we want them to offset each other, then any increase in government spending should be matched with an increase in taxes, right? Because that change in government spending, we're thinking about our budget. Our budget for the government was taxes minus government spending minus transfer payments. So if I increase government spending, I would also have to then increase, right, my tax revenue. Right? So these things would kind of offset each other in terms of shifting the aggregate demand curve. So we wouldn't be necessarily changing any inflationary, deflationary gaps if they completely offset each other. So we said, what did we need? We said that change in government spending would always be the same as that change in taxes, but multiplied by that marginal propensity to consume, which was always less than one. Right? So we needed that change in government spending was always going to be less than the necessary change in taxes to equally offset each other. Okay. So I kind of went through this last class, but I just want to kind of make that point again. Right. And we'll kind of see this in this next example. So in the following slide, and we worked through a similar example here, but just once again, reviewing this, getting more practice. Let's say I gave you, I want to have my values pulled up in here so I don't have to waste this much time. So let's say we had a consumption function, which was 0.8 times that disposable income plus 500. Okay. Well, I think in the slide I told you there's a recessionary gap, but how could we determine this, right? Well, if disposable income was told to us to be 1,000, then actual consumption would be 0.8 times that disposable income plus this autonomous consumption. So that would give us 1,300. When we're thinking about what is the inflation or deflationary gap, it's going to be the actual level of potential GDP if people spent all of that income, right? However, we're going to be subtracting that from what is actual consumption. So this is potential, this is actual, right? So the gap that we would have existing here would be a gap of 300, right? That short run GDP, current consumption, is greater than that potential GDP, which is our long run GDP. So here, the consumption was too high. Oh, what do I have here? I actually want, yes, we've got an inflationary gap. Right? I think the slides I have recessionary gap, but we could kind of work through either example here. We'll kind of do one where we have an inflationary gap. I should have this as what do I want here? I wanted to flip the kind of the actual consumption, but work through this example. I'll kind of come back to the slides here in a second. So if we have an inflationary gap, right, we actually want that GDP to be lower. Right? Sorry, current consumption to be lower to get to that long run GDP. So what do we need to do? We need to decrease that actual consumption by 300. So the change that we need in kind of our real GDP would have to be minus the marginal propensity to consume, or kind of our multiplier. So if we want to reduce GDP by 300 to get to that potential level of GDP, then we'd have here our marginal propensity to consume is from our, consumption function. So times 1 over 1 minus 0.8, which here I'd have what? Government spending times 5. Okay. So how much would I need to kind of close this gap? That would be 600. Or remember, this is how much I want to reduce GDP, right? So I would need to actually see a decrease in government spending, right? If I had the opposite being true, so I had a consumption function where I had real GDP being too low, I want to increase it by 300. Well, there I would need to increase government spending by that amount of 60. Okay. So we went through an example similar to this last class. We take the consumption function, disposable income, determine the gap. What is the response needed by the government to then close that gap? What value would we need? So yeah, how do we know that that value is negative, right? So this level of disposable income, this would have to be if we were at that point. So remember, we said we had that 45-degree line and then kind of actual consumption. We want those two to be equal to each other. If consumption, if the actual consumption was too high, we want it, if the actual consumption level is too high, then we need to reduce kind of our GDP, right? We currently kind of have the actual consumption being greater than, and the y-axis here wasn't kind of, this was our real GDP. It wasn't actually measuring what that gap was. So the actual consumption is too high. When we kind of put that in terms of our aggregate demand model, there we kind of saw that real GDP was too high. We wanted to reduce it. So what you're always going to do to determine your gap, maybe think about it this way, is you'll take actual consumption, subtract your disposable income. If consumption is too high, right, that short run GDP is too high, we actually have an inflationary gap. We want to reduce, right, GDP, or we would want to kind of cause it to go down by 300. If the disposable income is ever greater, we would have a negative gap. We would have kind of this recessionary gap, which means we want to increase GDP. So we would need to increase it by 300. So it's kind of goofy because when you calculate the gap, if you have a positive gap, right, that's inflationary, you actually want to reduce what that current level of GDP is so you get those two to kind of match up. Oh, match up here. Okay. Does that help answer that question, or are you still kind of okay? So that was kind of a little bit of a review of where we left off. So we're going to start from, is it slide 23 to kind of introduce some new stuff here today. So let's assume that we're looking at our old aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply model. And we've got these two kind of curves intersecting, right? But then both of them increase, right? So what happens if the aggregate demand increase is less than the long run aggregate supply increase, right? Well, if that's the case, we'll end up with a recessionary gap. If we have a recessionary gap, right, this means that the aggregate demand increases were overshadowed by increases in productivity, which is other category, which is typically kind of investments in capital or kind of the effectiveness of capital, labor supply, or education. Right? So I kind of have an example here. If we had a growing labor force, that's the one I'll kind of use to kind of then build out this visual kind of depiction in graph form. Okay. So if we want to close this gap, we need to increase aggregate demand. What tools can we use? Well, from last class, if we have a deflationary gap, that means we want to increase GDP. We would use expansionary fiscal policy. What was expansionary fiscal policy? So we want to increase things. We would, or we kind of increase our expenditures, the amount of money that's out there, increase government spending, or how can we put more money out there for consumers to use? We could decrease taxes. So how exactly is this working? What does this look like? Okay. So I think I've got a slide here. There we go, which we'll kind of talk about here in just a second. But I want to show you something that's a little bit more simple first. So, oh, was I not sharing my screen there? Can someone confirm that with me? Was I not sharing my screen?
No, we just saw
No.
the
Okay,
paper.
thank you. Sorry if I ever start doing some of that. So here, this is what I was just saying in words, right? We kind of had it here. Okay. So I'll build this out and kind of touch on all these points. And then we'll talk about a much more complicated version of this, but to kind of keep it simple to introduce the idea. Let's say we started out, we've got our aggregate demand curve. We have our long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so we start out here. This is kind of the current level of long run and also kind of short run GDP, right? They started out at the same point. And just as a reminder, we've got real GDP down here, and we've got prices. So what's going to occur if we have an increase in one of these factors of pull? So for right now, we'll just assume that whatever our short run aggregate supply was before, it hasn't changed. Okay. So if that's the case, right, where would our new kind of long run GDP be? Well, it's going to be wherever our new long run aggregate supply curve would be. So we can kind of think about here's our new long run GDP. But if that shift, that change in pull, make sure I have this lining up with the slides. I believe I told you that it was greater than the aggregate demand increase. So if at the same time we saw one of these factors of pull increase, so maybe this was like we saw an increase in our labor supply. If that's a larger change than what we see from an increase in aggregate demand, right? So maybe here we have the government increasing their spending, right? Well, what would that increase in spending do, right? Initially, without that long run aggregate supply change, it would have caused our GDP in that short run to go up. So without this long run aggregate supply shift, what did we create? Well, now GDP is higher than the initial long run level. We would have had an inflationary gap, right? However, if the change in one of these factors of pull is larger than that government spending increase, Where is kind of our new long run GDP? Well, it's going to be out here. So currently in the short run, with that government spending, our GDP is still lower than our new long run GDP if these things happen simultaneously. Right? So in this case, even if we see an increase in government spending, if we have a simultaneous shift in long run aggregate supply, we would actually end up with a recessionary gap. So what would the government then need to do? Right? So even if that change in aggregate demand, let's say it didn't come from government spending. Let's say it came from, I don't know, an increase in investments. Right? Well, even if we see an increase in investment, if it's smaller than that change to one of those factors of pull, we still end up with a recessionary gap, which means the government needs to do what? Well, they would either need to increase government spending or decrease taxes so that they shift that aggregate demand or increase that aggregate demand curve until we get to this new long run GDP. Now, you kind of think about it as after that government spending, now our short run GDP, our long run GDP match up. We have no gap. Okay. Now, the problem is going to be, so let's say we had these changes. If the government didn't spend any money, you can kind of think about, I try to draw this kind of, maybe even prices stay the same. All right. So you kind of think about this. Even if we had these simultaneous shifts, maybe prices stayed the same. However, if we correct for that recessionary gap in the short run, what have we done to prices? Well, if the new aggregate demand is higher, our new long run outcome is going to be up here. What have we caused? We've caused inflation. So we closed that recessionary gap, but it came at a cost of that we increased price levels. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? So I think here it's going to be valuable if I also go through an example of first, before we complicate that, what if instead I had a similar sort of scenario? So I kind of start out here. Here was my initial kind of long run GDP, initial price level. Let's say that we had kind of a small increase in one of those factors of pull. What that should do is increase our long run GDP. But if that occurs and the short run aggregate supply doesn't immediately kind of adjust, right, just to kind of put a simplifying assumption here, what if instead the aggregate demand shifts? So maybe let's say net exports go way up at the same time as, I don't know, productivity increased, right? So we kind of had these simultaneous changes. One of the factors of pull increased, but one of the factors of aggregate demand also increased, and it was a larger change or a larger kind of shift or a larger effect. Well, now if that aggregate demand increase is much larger, where is our new short run GDP? It's now going to be higher than what the potential or long run GDP should be. If this is the case, what do we have? Well, if GDP is too high, we now have not a recessionary, but an inflationary gap. So in response to an inflationary gap, what should the government do? Well, we want to now decrease GDP to that long run level. We can either decrease government spending or we could increase taxes. If we do that, the amount that we would want to close that gap, tried to hit it exactly on. I'm a little bit off, it looks like. But we would actually want to then cause this decrease in aggregate demand to kind of push us back to that long run level, eliminating that inflationary gap. Okay. So here the relative size of those changes matters. Okay. Right? Depending on which one is larger, we had the exact opposite kind of impacts here. Any questions on that before we keep moving? So I'm going to complicate this a little bit. Let me double check something here. Okay. So let's just look at this slide and I'll build the other one out for us. But let's say, oops, we started out and now we're going to factor in. So even if that we have simultaneous changes. So here I said, okay, what if we have that long run aggregate supply increase, but at the same time we see this simultaneous shift in aggregate demand? Right? Well, if the short run aggregate supply kind of shifts the same amount as long run aggregate supply, we would actually end up still at this kind of new long run GDP, and we actually wouldn't have a gap. So in my previous example, I kind of shut down, or I assumed that there was no shift in my short run aggregate supply. In practicality, there's likely going to be some shift in short run aggregate supply, but it's not going to be complete in the short run. It's not going to completely adjust. It's not going to shift all the way down to this level. So even if we have changes in short run aggregate supply, as long as they're smaller than that shift in our long run, sorry, I might have said it, I might have mixed my words up there as I'm talking. As long as that short run aggregate supply shift is smaller than that long run aggregate supply shift, we would still end up, right, with that recessionary gap. If the aggregate demand shift is much smaller than our long run aggregate supply, and that short run aggregate supply doesn't completely adjust, we would get the same impact as the examples I drew out, which was like no shifts in short run aggregate supply. So we would kind of see the same effects there. What do we now have? We've got a recessionary gap. How do we correct for that? We increase aggregate demand by either increasing government spending or decreasing taxes. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So what if instead we had that same impact, and I kind of already drew this one out, but the aggregate demand increase was greater than? Well, we already worked through that one. We said in that case, what's going to happen? Well, we've now created an inflationary gap. We want to close that gap by reducing short-run GDP. How can we do that? Contractionary fiscal policy, right? Reducing the aggregate demand, reducing kind of short-run real GDP. We can do that through a decrease in government spending or an increase in taxes. Now, once again, we can still have short run aggregate supply shifts. It's just that they aren't completely shifting to that new long run outcome. Right? So I've got an example, drawn out here, but I'm going to kind of build it out for us so we can kind of see this take place. So let's assume that we have this example where we start out, here's our aggregate demand curve. Here's our long run aggregate supply and our initial short run aggregate supply. So initially we had long run and short run GDP being the same. We have no gap. If there is a change in the factor of pull, why? And let's just assume for right now that we had, what color do I want to use? This aggregate demand kind of increase. Well, if that short run aggregate supply curve actually shifted by the same amount, we would end up at this new equilibrium where our long run GDP would be the same as our short run GDP. However, if that short run aggregate supply curve doesn't shift all the way out to this point, let's say it doesn't completely adjust in it and it only shifts by this much, right? So that shift in our short run aggregate supply, I kind of try to draw this to scale. It's smaller than that long run aggregate supply increase. Well, even if there's a simultaneous change in aggregate demand, so once again, maybe this came from, remember, C plus I plus G plus net exports. Even if it came from an increase in consumption, right? If that change in consumption was smaller than our long run aggregate supply increase, what do we end up with? Well, in our previous example, where we had no change, excuse me, in our short run aggregate supply, we said there was a recessionary gap. Even if we have a response by our short run aggregate supply, but things don't adjust completely in the short run, even if we don't have that assumption where we closed down that supply, short run aggregate supply shift, we still end up with GDP in the short run being too low. If it's too low, we said we would have a recessionary gap. We want to close that gap. We would have to then increase aggregate demand even more. How do we do that? Increase government spending, right? Or kind of within our consumption function, how would we increase consumption? We would actually reduce taxes. Okay. Subtracting a smaller amount increases consumption, shifting our aggregate supply enough to kind of close that gap. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Now, what do I want to say here? I just want to connect this to some things we've already talked about. So what occurs if we had government spending or decreasing taxes in order to achieve that long run level? Well, notice relative to where the old equilibrium would have been, right? Our prices have went up, right? So by increasing government spending, right, what did we actually do to our price level? We increased it, right? Now, if we had waited, right, for short run aggregate supply to kind of adjust, right, if we had a recessionary gap, we said people would expect prices to kind of be lower in the future. This deflationary expectation would cause changes in the investment in the physical cap. Eventually, we would kind of see this short run aggregate supply increase in response to that, pushing us down to this new long run level where prices would be a little bit lower than if we used that expansionary fiscal policy. So this is the idea that when we use fiscal policy, because we're, this is being a little bit facetious, but because we're impatient, we, yes, can close that gap, but we've caused prices to be even higher, right? If we would have been patient and allowed short run aggregate supply to adjust, we'd end up at that same long run level. And prices would be lower. It's just that in the short run, we kind of have bad economic times where we have this recessionary gap. GDP is too low. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. And then the exact opposite could be true. If we had these simultaneous changes and that short run aggregate response isn't as large as that aggregate demand kind of increase at the same time, where would our new short run GDP be? Or it's where our new short run aggregate supply hits aggregate demand. That's at a kind of current GDP that's too high. Well, there we had an inflationary gap. GDP was too high. We want to reduce it. What would we do? We need to decrease our aggregate demand curve. How can we do that? Well, decreases in the aggregate demand would have to mean we either increase taxes or decrease government spending. So it's using the same principles we talked about last class, just kind of complicating it with simultaneous shifts. On the quiz or the exam, I would give you questions, and we'll look at the daily quiz here today, where I shut down that short run aggregate supply change just to make it a little bit easier. But I wanted to kind of go, show you some examples where you can still see the short run aggregate supply change while the long run aggregate supply is changing. It's just that if it doesn't change by the exact amount as long run aggregate supply, then we aren't going to end up at this. In the short run, we won't end up at that long run level. We're going to end up with kind of either inflation or a deflationary gap. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. Um, so the next thing that we'll kind of discuss is when we have this government response to inflation or deflationary gaps, that's going to be the immediate effect in our aggregate demand, long-run aggregate supply model. However, when we change government spending or we change taxes, it's going to have a secondary effect. So we'll call this the kind of crowding out effect. So let's say we had a deflation, or sorry, a recessionary gap, and we want to engage in expansionary policy. We want to increase that current GDP, push it towards long-run levels. So this is either an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes. Well, if we increase government spending or we decrease taxes, that would increase price levels and increase our real GDP. And we kind of just worked through that. However, right, we're also going to see an impact of that it's going to decrease our supply of loanable funds, right? Remember, if we had an increase in government spending, there's less available money for the government to invest, right? So the supply of loanable funds would go down. If the supply of loanable funds decreases, that's going to push interest rates up. Now, the same impact would happen if we had a decrease in taxes, right? Because if we have this kind of decrease in taxes, we said people have more available funds to consume, right? They're going to be more likely to consume. We would see private savings actually decrease as well, shifting our supply curve to the left, pushing up interest rates. Once we said interest rates are higher, that would also kind of decrease the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. We're going to see the overall level of investment in the economy decrease. What was one of the components of aggregate demand? Investment into physical capital. So if investment falls, so would aggregate demand, which would then kind of have counter effects to the initial change in government spending or taxes, right? So if we change government spending by an amount that we believe we've closed the gap, well, then there's an additional change in aggregate demand. Well, we might not end up at the level we want to, right? I'll kind of draw this out for us here in a second. So the secondary effect is that when I increase government spending, I'm going to cause investment into capital or planned investment to decrease, which will then push my aggregate demand to still be too low, and I still have a recessionary gap. Okay. So what is this going to look like? Kind of tying in some things that we've talked about before to this module. Right? So initially, let's say you have this scenario. And so here was my, actually, sorry. Wait, I need to, hold on. I don't need to draw the market in equilibrium for us. So let's say we had here, so this is real GDP, price levels. Here's our long run aggregate supply. And let's say we're just currently at a point. And what did I have in the slides initially? Yeah. So our long run GDP should be here, but our short run GDP is currently here. Okay. So because short run GDP is less than our long run GDP or potential GDP, we know that we have a recessionary gap. What can we do to close that gap? Well, we're going to, let's say, decrease taxes. Okay. If we're wanting to decrease taxes, that's going to cause our aggregate demand curve to shift up. If we get the amount correct, we now kind of force our GDP in the short run to match up with long-run GDP, we've closed that gap. Okay. The problem is, if we go back to an earlier module, that kind of quantity of loanable funds, and then we had real interest rates. We said there was some supply for loanable funds and some demand for loanable funds. Right? So if consumers have more available funds, or their tax levels are lower, they're not going to want to save as much, right? Because they don't have to kind of pay for these higher taxes. They're going to have more available funds to consume. So the supply of loanable funds would actually, just another color here, just to kind of match this up. This should be kind of red. So our supply of loanable funds is going to go down, right? What happens then to our equilibrium quantity of loanable funds and interest rates? Well, interest rates are going to increase. The quantity of loanable funds is going to decrease. When interest rates are higher, it's more costly to borrow. So what are we going to see from investment in the physical capital? Well, if it's more costly to borrow, we'll actually see that decrease. One of the components of aggregate demand was that we would kind of see this investment decrease. Right? So if we see investments decrease, that's going to cause our aggregate demand curve to decrease. So that secondary effect is it pushes our GDP to be too low. We still have a recessionary gap existing. Okay, so that secondary or that crowding out effect, because changes in government spending or taxes will create changes in the loanable funds market, which has direct impacts on investments into physical capital. If we close the gap, the secondary or the crowding out effect would actually not, that same amount of government spending or tax changes would not have reduced the gap enough, right? Now, without the secondary effect, it was fine. It's just once we have that kind of secondary effect, we didn't increase it enough. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? So just as a thought experiment, what would I actually want to do if I expected this crowding out or the secondary effect? What would I want to do to, let's say, government spending in order to end up with, after this secondary effect, I want no gap. Instead of changing government spending by this amount, what would I actually want to do? Change it by a little bit more, right? So if I'm thinking about that this secondary effect exists, what will the change in government spending always be if we're expecting that to occur? We're always going to want to have it be a little bit higher, right? That without the secondary effect, we would see like an inflationary gap created because of government spending. But because we know the response to that change in interest rates will then shift it back down, if we kind of overshoot it, that secondary effect would then kind of push it back down to that original level we wanted, which was where there was no gap. Does that make sense? Or are there any questions on the idea? I can kind of go into that a little bit further here. Okay. So this idea of kind of our crowding out effect, once again, if we close that gap, the response because of investments are going to decrease. We actually don't close it. We still end up with a recessionary gap. Now it's not as large as it was before, right? So we have reduced it, but just not by full amount. Okay. What if we have the exact opposite? So when would we want to use, first of all, to kind of review some of these concepts? When would I want to use contractionary fiscal policy? So contractionary, I want to decrease my GDP. When do I want to decrease the current GDP levels? When they're currently too high. If they're too high, that told us we had an inflationary gap. Okay. So if I have an inflationary gap and I use contractionary fiscal policy, so I either decrease government spending or increase taxes, well, there I'd see a decrease in aggregate demand. That's going to push GDP to be lower. However, um, at these lower kind of price levels, right? Government spending, right? There's now more available funds. The government isn't spending them. They can take out loans or invest that money. So we're going to see an increase in the supply of loanable funds. That pushes interest rates down. If interest rates are lower, the cost of investment is lower. More firms are going to invest, right, into projects. We'll see an increase in investments in the physical capital, which increases our aggregate demand. Increases in aggregate demand kind of push our GDP to be higher. So decreases in government spending will increase investment. Therefore, it's not the planned amount that we wanted. Aggregate demand is actually higher than the amount that would close the gap, and we still have an inflationary gap existing. Okay. So, kind of, I said, if we have time, right, then draw this out. So, just to kind of go through it, I'm going to actually add in something to that thought experiment with slides that was kind of relating to what I was talking about before. So, let's say I've got my aggregate demand. I've got my long run aggregate supply. So I know that the long run GDP level should be right here. Okay. Well, if I had a scenario where I started out and the current short run GDP is too high, well, there we said we had an inflationary gap, right? So what do I want to do? I actually want to cause GDP to go down. Now, when I decrease GDP, right, how can I do that? So we said one way that I could do that is by decreasing government spending. If I decrease government spending, what happens in the loanable funds market? Well, previously, we started out here, but if the government spending goes down, they now have more available funds to invest or kind of take out these loans. And so we would see the supply of loanable funds, government has more money, the public kind of savings would increase, which does what? Push the quantity of loanable funds up. Interest rates are now lower. Lower interest rates would then increase investments into physical capital, which would cause aggregate demand to now increase. Remember, aggregate demand, we had the components were C plus I plus G plus net exports. Okay. So if I'm the government, right, I know that by decreasing my government spending, it's going to be counteracted by increases in investment. So what might I want to do? I decrease government spending by a lot. Now, initially, we might think, okay, well, that's going to cause not an inflationary gap, but we're now going to have a recessionary gap. However, we did this in anticipation of the fact that investments were going to increase because that change, right, in government spending caused a change in the loanable funds market, which caused interest rates to change, which caused investment to change. So if we had planned on this, we decreased government spending by an amount more than what was needed to close the gap, because we know that once we had this decrease in government spending, it was going to be counteracted by this increase in investments. So if we do this correctly, if we correctly identify what that response would be from that lower interest rate, well, there we decrease government spending by an amount more than what would close the gap. And then the secondary effect kind of closes now that recessionary gap that would have existed, and we can end up at that long run equilibrium point where we have no gap existing. Okay. Excuse me. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? So I'm going to keep an eye on time. All right. Let's jump into this quiz. We'll get kind of a little more review of these concepts, and then might not have quite as much time as I wanted to today, so we might spill over some of this into next class, but make sure we get this daily quiz in here today. So this first question, right, we're going to be thinking about what happens if we have those simultaneous changes. So here we've got initially no gap in current and potential GDP. If the long-run aggregate supply decreases by an amount that's less than the aggregate demand decrease, and we assume that short-run aggregate supply stays the same, what type of gap will exist? And as a response, what should the government do? And then our second question is about how the government should respond and kind of then the secondary effect of fiscal capital investments. So for the first one, right, we said, okay, what if, and here I'm thinking I'm working through an example that's a little bit different than what we had before, just so we get an idea of like all the different types that we could see, all the different combinations of simultaneous shifts. So originally we started out we were told there's no inflationary deflation or recessionary gap. So we have simultaneous changes, which is that the long run aggregate supply decreases by an amount. So that would push our long run GDP to be lower. Right? However, if there's no shift in the short run aggregate supply, right, but we simultaneously have a decrease in government spending or anything really, this doesn't have to necessarily be a decrease in government spending. This could be a decrease in, we said, consumption, investments, etc. Right? If that change in aggregate demand is larger, right, then our new short-run GDP would actually be too low. If it's too low, we said we have now a recessionary gap. Right? So maybe the government did spend too much money. What could they then do? I think the question is phrased of what should they, do as a result of this. So when this occurred, we created a recessionary gap. That was the first part of the question. Okay. Or a deflationary gap, right? Those two terms are interchangeable. In response to that, what should the government do? Well, I think the options you have, they could increase or decrease kind of government spending there, or increase or decrease taxes. So if this was the case, right, we actually want to increase aggregate demand. What would we do? Well, the government then needs to either increase their spending or kind of decrease their taxes, shifting our aggregate demand curve to be up here, right? Closing that gap. Okay. So we had a deflationary gap initially. The response to that should be that we have an increase in government spending. Okay. Now, I think in terms of the question that was asked here, what if instead I had the opposite being true? So I think I had what I actually wanted in this problem was the opposite of the one we just worked through. So if you're filling out this quiz, the next one I'm about to work through, I'll change the wording so that when you go back, you can kind of see what I intended. But the actual response there should be an inflationary gap and increases in taxes, the exact opposite. Because what if instead we had a scenario, so same problem, right? But let's say that we initially started out no gap. But what if that aggregate demand shift was less than the long run aggregate supply shift? Well, here we were looking at decreases. So we said, what if that long run aggregate supply decrease was much larger, right? Well, that should push our new kind of long-run GDP to be out here, right? But if this simultaneous shift or decrease in aggregate demand was much smaller, right, where is our new short-run GDP? It would actually be at a level that is too high. We would have still an inflationary gap existing because that relative size of the shifts. If that shift in aggregate demand was lower, we have an inflationary gap. What do we want to do? Well, we could decrease government spending, but what's another way that we could shift our aggregate demand curve so that we push the short run GDP to be lower? Not a decrease in government spending, but we could also increase taxes. So the wording that I intended in that question was, what if the long run aggregate supply shift is larger than the aggregate demand decrease or the aggregate demand shift? So inflationary gap and increases in taxes, that should be the response to that question once I correct the wording there. But it doesn't matter. If I change the wording, we could still work through the exact opposite. Same principles would apply. It's just that we're looking at one being larger than the other. We're just kind of flipping that sign. Okay. Any questions on that one before we keep moving? So let's say we'll make this a little bit more simple. So we'll take a step away from, so the answer should, yeah, so it should be inflationary and increased taxes, right? That second example was what I wanted question one to be. Okay. But I could have changed it, right? So that we had the relative size of the shifts be the exact opposite, in which case we would just have the exact opposite answers, right? Instead of a recessionary gap and decreasing taxes, we have this inflationary gap and increasing taxes. It's asking about government spending. You still, yeah. So the second part doesn't specifically ask. It gives you two options, right? It's a change in government spending or a change in taxes. We could use either one. But if I was using government spending here, I wouldn't actually want to increase it. What would I actually want to do? Well, I want to push aggregate demand lower. There, another possible response that could be correct, although it's not one of the options, is that you would see a decrease in government spending. The second question we haven't worked through yet, right? The first question is kind of the one we were looking at there. Does that answer your question? Oh, if I can pull the chat open here. Okay, that's okay. I kind of changed it on the fly there. So what if instead we have a scenario where we start out and we're at this point where long run, short run GDP are the same, right? We had no gap existing. We then have labor supply increases. Well, if labor supply increases, that was one of our factors of pull. So that would increase our long run GDP. However, if we increase our long run GDP, what happens to our short run GDP? Well, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply haven't shifted. So, and even if they did, right, if that short run aggregate supply shifted a little bit, we would still end up at a point where that short run GDP is now less than our kind of new long run GDP. So what type of gap would we have here? GDP is too low, so a recessionary or deflationary gap. So that's the first part. In response to that, what do we want to do? Well, we actually want to increase aggregate demand. So how can we do that? Well, this question specifically asks about government spending. So if I want to increase aggregate demand, what do I need to do? Increase my government spending. Or if this was a potential, if I gave you a kind of different setup and I said, give you possible options, another correct answer could be that you decrease taxes. Now, this question isn't phrased in terms of taxes. It's just asking about government spending. So that second part is we could increase government spending. But if I change it to be what would the government do to taxes, in order to increase aggregate demand, we need to decrease taxes. Okay. Now, if we have an amount of spending that closes that gap, what's the secondary or crowding out effect? Well, we said here if we increase government spending, what have we done in the supply for loanable funds market, or supply for loanable funds in the loanable funds market, right? Well, what we've done is relative to the kind of starting point. So we had supply, demand for loanable funds. Our initial interest rates were right here. If the government increases their spending, there's less available public funds to invest, or the supply of savings would go down, right? If interest rates are higher, right, we said that planned investment in the physical capital is going to be lower. It's now more costly to borrow in order to make these investments. One of the components of aggregate demand was investments, right? So if investments fall, instead of being at this new point, our new aggregate demand is actually going to be a little bit lower because of this reduction in investments, which would actually cause our short-run GDP levels to be here. They're still too low, and we've got a recessionary gap after that secondary response occurs. So for that second question, we said initially there was a recessionary gap. To close the gap, the government increased their spending. But if they only increased it an amount where they didn't plan for that secondary effect, once that secondary effect occurs, we're still going to have a recessionary gap existing. Now it's smaller than it was before the government spending increase, but it still is going to exist. On that idea. So the correct answers for question one, we said it was this example we worked through here, right? If that the effect of that long run aggregate supply was larger than the aggregate demand increase, or sorry, decrease, then we would end up with an inflationary gap, and we would need to increase taxes in response to that. Excuse me. Any other questions there? Um, I think here, because the relative size matters, I'm not asking you as many questions about just the direction of the change. I guess you could draw them out on separate graphs. Let me think. Yeah, you could do it that way if that's helpful. Um, you won't be able to necessarily, I think I think it'll be a little more difficult conceptually to think about why that recession or inflationary gap exists. Because, notice in this example, I still see that actually, no, sorry. I, I, I would hesitate to do them on different graphs because there you're just thinking about the directional change. Both of these changes decreased GDP, right? However, we don't, here in this model, we don't care about just the direction change because both of them decrease GDP. It matters which one of them decreases it by more in order to determine if there was an inflation or deflationary gap. In previous modules, when we were having simultaneous shifts, we really were just there focusing on, was the resulting equilibrium GDP higher or lower? Well, if they both decrease, we're always going to end up with GDP being lower. It's just now the question that we're being asked about is, yes, they would both cause GDP to decrease, but what's now the difference in the new short and long run GDP? So there, if you draw them out in separate graphs, that's not necessarily going to tell you that because in both of them, you'll see that GDP decreases. The real thing that matters is which one of them decreased it more. Does that make sense? So you still can do it on separate graphs. You just have to remember they're both going to tell you that GDP goes down, but there you would need to then look at the problem and, okay, which one of them caused GDP to go down by more, right? Okay. So yeah, a little bit different than the simultaneous changes that we looked at. Because we're focused on a slightly different thing here. Not just the directional change of GDP, we're really focusing on what was the gap that was created. 15 minutes here. So let's look at where we're at in the slides. So here, PowerPoint slides. So we kind of worked through this example. Or no, we haven't kind of worked through this. Sorry. Do we have time to do this today? That should take us like no time at all. There is an issue with module 10 that I kind of wanted to address. I think if I go through this, I'll still have time to. So let's go through one example of this, and then I'll start next class kind of reviewing this before we jump into module 11 tomorrow. So kind of similar to the crowding out effect, but it's a different concept. But we're thinking about, let's say I have expansionary fiscal policy. So I've got a recessionary gap. I want to increase GDP, I increase government spending, or I reduce tax rates. Well, another secondary effect that we could see existing, if I reduce tax rates, what's that going to do? Well, it decreases the available income. Like if I use, if I decrease income taxes, that increases the amount of available income. So what could that do? Well, if income taxes are lower, essentially from working, you would get a larger amount, you keep a large amount of money. And so more people are going to want to be likely to join the labor force, or you would see an increase in labor supply. Now, a similar kind of idea, maybe it's not just new workers, maybe it's the existing workers want to work even more. So it's the supply of labor. It's not just the number of workers, it's the number of like labor hours. Right? Also, if we see a reduction instead of from income taxes, capital gains taxes, individuals will now save more, right? Because now investing in the stocks, I get to keep more of that money. Potentially, we see them take that money, increase their investments into education. So that would also kind of change a factor of pull, right? Labor, education, or if I use corporate taxes, now companies have more, if they're earning these profits, they've paid lower taxes, they have more money to then invest back into capital, right? Maybe part of that investment is improving technologies or productivity. That also increases one of the factors of pull. So if we use taxes, right, potentially there's going to be an offset of this fiscal policy by a secondary effect is that we change long run aggregate supply. Okay. So even if these are anticipated tax changes, they would have similar effects. I just want to kind of make that note here. So why is that the case? Right? Well, expansionary fiscal policy should do what? It should increase aggregate demand and increase our GDP levels. However, if at the same time that then causes increases in labor supply, productivity, or investments into education, we would see that long run aggregate supply shifts to the right, which actually would increase GDP as well. So once again, our relative size of these shifts matters, right? So here, if I think about what that relative size looks like, we'll kind of work through this example. I've got it in the slides here, and I'll kind of build this out. I'll draw this out for us here, because I think we'll have, yeah, we've got enough time here. I can do this. So let's assume, kind of start it out. Here's my aggregate demand. Here's my long run, short run aggregate supply. I'm going to kind of abbreviate this here to get through things a little bit quicker. Right, and this was kind of long, short run, we started out the same. If I decrease my taxes, the initial impact on aggregate demand would be that it increases aggregate demand, right? So what's that going to do? It's going to cause my short run GDP to go up, right? But let's assume here that that initial aggregate demand increase is less than the impact that that decrease in taxes, whether it's corporate income taxes or capital gains, that shift is less than the long run aggregate supply shift that's caused by these increases in our factors, right, our pull, right, our factors of long run aggregate supply. Well, if that's the case, where should kind of this new long run GDP be? So once again, just for simplicity, I'll shut down the supply curve change here. Sorry, short run aggregate supply curve change, just to kind of make this easier to see. So where would the new long run level be? Well, it's going to be out here at a higher value than our current kind of short run GDP. So what has occurred? That secondary effect, because that change in taxes was impacting these factors of pull, our short run GDP is less than our long run GDP, and we actually now have a recessionary gap, or a recessionary gap. Okay. So that secondary effect, even though initially we might have thought because we had this decrease in tax rates, we thought that GDP was going to be too high. We thought maybe we'd create an inflationary gap. The secondary response in long run aggregate supply, because that would then cause a change in one of the factors of pull that actually caused GDP in the long run to go even higher. We now in the short run would have, we're not saying in the long run, it's potential GDP. So we would now have kind of instead this recessionary gap. So kind of similar when we're thinking about there's going to be this initial change, but then there's a secondary change as well. You So in terms of the short run aggregate supply shift, you can ignore it. I won't ask you questions that kind of factor in how much it shifted by. This would be kind of all you would need to kind of think about those relative size of the shifts in aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. In practice, you could add it in and it still doesn't change anything. So actually this depiction, I made it even harder. So initially there wasn't no gap. Initially, what did I have here? Okay. Initially, I kind of had there was a recessionary gap. I thought I closed it by increasing government spending, but then the response in these factors of pull actually caused my potential GDP to go even higher. So even if short run aggregate supply shifts, we still end up with this recessionary gap. Okay. So same thing, it's just here you can kind of show that it could occur even if you have that short run aggregate supply shift as well. And kind of similar to our earlier examples, just if that shift in short run aggregate supply can't completely adjust in the short run to what that long run level would be. So yeah, if it's easier to think about the one that I drew out, thinking in the questions, I would give you like an assumption just to make it easier. There's no change in short run aggregate supply. Okay. So two types of secondary responses. One, we were thinking about the impact on the loanable funds market. We also could then think about the effects on the factors of pull. I'll never combine the two, but in reality, they both could occur. Right? There'd be like two secondary effects there, and it would get even more complicated. But I won't do that to you. Okay. Um, so I'll start off next class where we kind of do the exact opposite. Maybe, we do instead of a decrease in tax rates, we do increases in tax rates. So we'll start off with that. Tomorrow, we'll kind of discuss a little bit about tax revenues and kind of the optimal taxes. This shouldn't take us much time at all. So probably the first 10, 15 minutes of class, we'll kind of revisit module 9 and then jump into module 11. Module 10, I was expecting you watch that video, do that module reading, and then answer those questions in the module 10 quiz that were related to that video. There was a slight issue in one of the questions in the daily quiz. It didn't line up with what I did in the video. So in case you use the video's response, I didn't mean for the values to be exactly the same, but this is what would happen if they were. Okay, so I don't worry about question one. I'll end up giving everybody credit for it because the values didn't match what was in the video. I actually wanted you to use different values, but I understand that there could have been some confusion there because typically we walk through these examples in class and we are using the same values. Here I was kind of trying to create an incentive like to actually make sure you're paying attention to what the video says and not just looking for the answers and automatically putting them in. Okay. But to be fair, I'll kind of update. I wanted to update those so that we can see if they were the same, this is how we would kind of solve it. So one of the things that module 10 video kind of discusses is when we're thinking about money that's being invested or deposited into the Fed, it's similar to our government spending and taxes. It's going to not just have the initial effect, it has a multiplier effect. Excuse me. So instead of the marginal propensity to consume, when the Fed receives money, the impact is going to be, well, I can take some of that money, I can loan it back out, and every time I loan it back out, I'm receiving more money back from individuals. Okay. So we said if, for example, the Fed has kind of this new deposit, right? So let's say I think this problem had $200,000, right? Well, they can't loan all of that out because the government sets kind of this required reserve ratio. Here in the problem, to match up with what I did in the video, it should have been 0.15. I changed it to 0.2 because I wanted you to work through it with different values. But once again, I understand the confusion of just trying to, mimic what I did in the video. So when it's a new deposit to the Fed, they can't loan all of this money out, right? Because initially they have to keep, so what was it here? What do I should I get these values correct? So I have what, 200,000. Right, so I would have 170,000 kind of left over. So if I have 100, sorry, this is 30,000. So the amount of excess reserves, or the amount of money I would have left over, was 170,000. Okay. That is the amount of money that I can then loan back out, right? So if that's the amount of money I could then take and loan back out, this is the amount that's going to impact our money supply. And it won't just be 170,000 because every time I loan it out, I get a new deposit. I have to set some of it aside. I now have more funds to then loan back out. I get a new deposit. I have to keep some of it set aside. I have more funds to loan out. So the total effect on our money supply from that initial $200,000 deposit was the initial amount of excess reserves I would have divided by whatever that required reserve ratio was, or multiplied by 1 over that required reserve ratio. So in our example, it would have been 170,000. That was the initial excess reserves I had from the initial deposit times 1 over 0.15, which I think is approximately what, 1,133,333 repeated. Okay. So that should have been kind of the correct answer there. If I had used the same value of 0.15 as I did in class, I had changed to 0.2. I wanted you to kind of work through it that way, but to be fair, this is kind of, the one that matches up with class. Okay. And I say class, the module 10 video that I used to replace kind of Monday's class. So if you already have answered it, I'll. Okay. So that should take us to the end. So there's one more thing I want to mention before we get out of here today. I won't go through it in depth, but it's very similar to that last Canvas discussion. We'll kind of get this fourth one now published. So you've got kind of 3 parts. You'll respond to each one of these parts, each one of these questions where you have prompts. I actually here pushing a little bit further, which is you have to kind of create your own prompts, tell me what they were, to kind of create some different graphs and then kind of analyze what those graphs tell you. And that gets you 10 points for responding to 1, 1A, 2, 2A, 3, and 3A. In response to that, right, you would then kind of respond, or after that, you would then respond to one other student's response for 2A and one other student's response to 3A. And then kind of compare and contrast, kind of you can read the instructions there, what their response was for that question 2A or 3A to what you had answered. Okay. So that'll be up there on Canvas. You can start working on that. I think I have the due date set to be the end of the day next Tuesday. So you've got quite a bit of time to get that done. I will get up a set of practice problems on Canvas later today for that next quiz, which won't be posted until after class on Friday because it's going to cover both module 9 and then kind of that combining of module 10 and 11. Okay. So I'm going to stop the recording there. But then if anyone has any questions over anything I just said,